I think for me, taking more risks, as I got more confident, I gradually took larger and larger risks. And I think at one point, you stop worrying about what other people think of you. So you kind of transcend other people's opinions. And then later, you start to transcend your own opinion. Your younger self, you have to let that person go.
Before we get started with the show, I wanted to offer you the chance potentially of a lifetime. If you're looking to get your brand in front of the boldest thinkers in business, this is the place to do it. The Unlearn podcast is downloaded in over 85 countries with a growing audience of over 100,000 listeners per month. That includes C-suite leaders, startup founders, and executives from Fortune 500 companies to scaling startups. We're ranked in the top 1% of business podcasts on Spotify and Apple across multiple regions. But our listeners just don't stream, they stick around, with 85% completing the entire show on their first listen. If your brand wants to align with bold ideas, breakthrough thinking, and a global audience that's not afraid to challenge the startup quo, get in touch. For the first time ever, we're offering sponsorship opportunities on the show, and we'd love to have you with us.
Enjoying the podcast? Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on YouTube. This way, you won't miss any episode, and it greatly supports our podcast.
Today on the Unlearn podcast, I'm joined by someone who's been shaping the future of software and companies that build it for a long time, Jamie Dobson. Now, Jamie is the co-founder of Container Solutions, where he spent the last decade helping executive teams not only adopt cloud-native technologies, but succeed with them. His superpower isn't understanding technical shifts, it's helping leaders navigate deep organizational change that comes to them. From writing his first lines of code on the BBC computer at the age of 9 and guiding the world's largest brands through digital transformations, Jamie's always focused on the human side of technology. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. In his new book, Visionaries, Rebels and Machines, it's a part manifesto, part field guide for anyone trying to lead in the age of complexity. It's a powerful look at how bold ideas, brave leaders, and better systems come together to shape progress, and then what gets in the way. This is a fascinating and fun conversation about rethinking leadership, especially a topic that Jamie loves and doesn't get to speak about enough. So let's dive into the show, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy this.
The first one was in a public library when I was 9. So I love the libraries then, I love them now. It's a place that's very quiet. Libraries and graveyards, best places in the world. And I took out a book on basic computer programming when I was 9. And my mum had bought us a Commodore 64 because they were cheap, because the Commodore Amiga had just come out. So we got that like for £3 off somebody. Anyway, so I programmed a computer in basic, and I loved that. I really loved that. So I wasn't a very creative child, not really artistic, but I did like storytelling and movies, and I really liked making computers do things. Now, you fast forward 20 odd years, and I'm drafted in as a professional computer programmer to help KLM build their web system. And, that was a time when internet shopping was not really a thing. And I was searching for something. There was something happening to me and the team I was in. So when I was in hyper creative mode, I would lose track of time. I was in the zone. And then when I started to move obstacles away from my team, they would get in the zone. And this was the moment when I discovered extreme programming. And I started to think, well, how do I get these people organized? I didn't realize I was a manager. Nobody said to me, you're a manager. But in that role of team lead, that's exactly what I was. Then I picked up a book because I was always reading. 20 years later, I'm still reading. Right? I want to program in basic. What do I need to do? I find a book. So I found a book, Maslow on Management. And the very first page, it hit me like a thunderbolt, because I'm a nice person. I want to help, but I'm no politician. So bang, right there on the first paragraph, it says, after studying a company in California, because Maslow was not a management consultant, he was a psychologist, he came to the conclusion that the proper organization of work and of people can have a therapeutic effect. So good people with proper management can become great people. And it was at that exact moment, I put the book down. I didn't even continue reading. I thought, I'll start a business and I'll improve the world through the management of people. And that was a huge moment in my life, because what came next, Container Solutions, all started that very day.
So there's two things that strike me first off, right? One is this idea of reading books, and when you find something, actually putting it into action straight away. Another person who does that is a lady called Teresa Torres. She's great. She wrote this book called Continuous Discovery Habits. And she has the same philosophy. She likes, I read a book until something in it hits me as like, I got to do that. And then she stops reading the book and starts performing the new behavior. Now, reading a book and deciding you're going to start a company, that's a little bit of a leap straight away off the back of it. So what were some of the things that, really helped you get moving on that? Because it's great to be inspired in that manner and then put it into action.
The problem is I was so naive back then. I thought it was normal. The expression in computing, read the manual or read the effing manual, people usually say. But it only dawned on me when I was in my 40s that most people don't do that. So literally, I just read the manual. If I've got a problem with HR, I study HR and immediately I put that into action. Now, I probably learned that formally from Peter Drucker. So he talks about that, learning something, implementing it. The strategist is a man of thought, a man of action. And what was the third one? The three things combined. Anyway, the point is that it's praxis, action and theory meet. And as an engineer, that spoke to me. I was doing this as early, as 9 years of age with the basic book. But what I didn't realise is just how rare that was.
Yeah.
And the other thing I used to tease people about, all the agile coaches in the world, and there's gazillions of them, if they were so good at product development, if XP was the silver bullet that so many people said it was, and it was a great way of developing software, how come all those agile coaches were not millionaires and running businesses? And I thought, I want to be that person. I don't want to be a hypocrite. I want to put my money where my mouth is. Now, whether or not I regret that, that's a different question. I wanted to put my money where my mouth is and see if I could do what Maslow suggested and if I could, be an agile person who could put it into action and really prove to the world that this stuff works in practice.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be said. Jeff Patton's another guy who always says that, people who can do it, and people who can't do, teach it. That's he always says that about product management, which is hilarious. But there's a lot to be said about that. We've had loads of great people on the show over the years. Like another person you're reminding me of is Kent Beck was on the show. It was actually the first show we ever did. And one of the things he said to me on the show is whenever he finds an idea that he totally disagrees with, thinks is not true and never going to work, the first thing he does is goes and tries it. And the whole point being, as you're describing, is this behavior of taking action to actually go find out or to prove or disprove or to actually really understand what it means. So when people are struck by inspiration, as you're describing, or as you felt reading those paragraphs in the opening page of a book, I think it is such a great behavior to be able to just say, right, now I'm going to do something with this. I'm going to try it. I'm going to, it's inspiring me to do something bigger than myself. I'm going to take on something audacious. So how do you get started with that? Because most people, I think, read books and they tick off, they've read another book, but does their behavior change? Probably not. Where you're coming at this, where I'm struck by something and I'm going to take on a new behavior. So what were some of the things that helped you get started or helps you get started when you have those moments?
I think it all started for me, and the question is whether I'm mentally healthy or not. I'm going to let you be the judge of that and your listeners be the judge of that. So on the one hand, you could say I was a high performer. I write things down, I hold myself to account, I take my job seriously, and I actually despise managers who don't take their job seriously, because as soon as you take on the management of people, or for example, the design of policies in any institution, you're impacting the world around you. Now, I thought all business people thought like that. So you could say, well, he's a high performer. He takes his job seriously. I write letters to myself. I've been doing that for 25 years. Every time something big happens, I write a letter to myself that I open in about 12 or 18 months to test where my expectations and reality, did they match? So I'm a complete management nerd before I even knew I was a manager. You could also say, well, maybe I'm a bit neurotic. Where does that desire come from? So I don't procrastinate. I precrastinate. And 30 years after graduating university, I still get the piss taken out of me because I would work out what was on the exam paper, what I needed to do before the term started. So if the lectures kicked off on the Wednesday, I'd already be at university Tuesday, hitting up my lecturers and finding out what needs to happen. So I was ambitious, but I think it was probably more driven from, a fear of failing than it was a dream of success. And as I got older and more mature, the fears of failure drifted away and then were replaced by dreams of success. So I think I was probably a bit of a scaredy cat, and that's how it started for me.
Yeah, and but it's interesting to hear you share again more of these things about what's getting you ticking over and into these sort of situations, but also I guess the reaction that it drives, right? Like most people, I don't think they know how to manage. They're certainly not trained well how to manage, and yet it has such a imbalanced effect on everybody who they manage in a way, right? Like I think like managers actually have a bigger effect on people's. You mentioned mental health, but individuals' mental health is severely impacted by the quality of management they have around them. If you have a crappy boss, if you're
Yeah.
put in a shit company or a toxic environment, you're spending almost a minimum of 40 hours of your, probably 60 waking hours, Monday to Friday in that environment, which has a huge effect on not only the time you're there, but when you go home, everything around it, and I don't feel like enough people do the type of discipline that you're describing. Granted, it's as you say, you have a system that is very detailed and disciplined that most people probably wouldn't have, but but you care about it, and that's kind of fascinating because I don't think people are as intentional in that way as they could be. So what helped you build that? A little bit of the fear, a little bit of the interest? Like, as you say, as you sort of evolved more, like what were the things that you were unlearning about yourself going through that process to get better at it as you started to manage more people or you built out this company?
I think for me, taking more risks, as I got more confident, I gradually took larger and larger risks. And I think at one point, you stop worrying about what other people think of you. So you kind of transcend other people's opinions. And then later, you start to transcend your own opinion. Your younger self, you have to let that person go. This is quite a normal sort of process in terms of emotional maturity. But if you can't let go of what people think, so people said to me, container solutions will never work. Now, this is not the first time I'd heard that. So when I was at KLM, I just started my PhD at the time, and the joke was, I called it conservative extreme programming. And the point is I adopted XP. I added a couple of extra practices on for dealing with the infrastructure team and dealing with the budgeting cycle. So it was just XP with a couple of extra things. As I got older, I took greater risks. And the more people, oh yeah, that was it. They said it will never work. XP will never work in the airline industry. And so when I was a younger man, I was very deferential and thought, oh, it won't work. And people used to say I was idealistic and I was naive and all of that. And that made me very lonely. It put me in a very lonely place to be told you're idealistic, that's not going to work around here. And then be told not to work on the weekends. But this is my passion. I love what I do. I love playing rugby. I love being out and about. So it made me very lonely and feel very constrained. Now, by the time I was in my 30s, I stopped listening to anybody who said, that's not going to work here, etc., etc. So I think learning or unlearning that respect element, don't be too deferential. I think that was a big moment for me. Probably happened in my mid-30s.
Yeah, look, it is a interesting bit, right? Where, especially I think when you do anything new that is against the grain, is hard, is not easy. Most people's reaction is to say it's never going to work, or I wouldn't do it that way, or most people sort of crave comfort rather than discomfort in their lives, and I think it's hard. So when you were thinking then about this idea and even the book of Visionaries, Rebels, and Machines, you know, was this the rebel era of your sort of story arc, or did it just give you, as you say, you started to let go of the baggage of what do people think of me, and then backing yourself more on taking riskier bets and maybe just just taking bets that probably were controlled because you'd found a system to manage them.
I think I have developed a system of managing bets. Visionaries, Rebels and Machines was, I was very naive again. And I think naivety is very important because you would never try something. If I really sat down and understood how difficult it was to write a book, I probably wouldn't have started.
Yeah,
And it's the same when you start a family. The first baby is really difficult. And I once read that part of your biological and cognitive makeup is to forget the early days of having a baby. Because if you truly remembered how awful it was, you'd never have another one. And that would be the end of the human race. So with Visionaries and Rebels, I felt I wanted to tell this story since that moment with Maslow. So it was all in my mind, roughly, the story of computing. So I knew that the personal computer came out of Xerox PARC. I had a vague notion that a man called Bob Taylor ran that team. Now, I knew that the transistor came out of Bell Labs, but like all computer programmers who are very dishonest about this, I'm scared of electronics, right? The electronic engineers are the smart ones. We're daft in comparison. So I knew one day I'd have to look at the transistor. Well, it took me 25 years. Now, the reason it took me so long is because I was the CEO of Container Solutions. But last year, about 18 months ago, I stepped down, and for the very first time in my life, I had time in my agenda. So I was like, okay, let's just take another look at them transistors again. And then I started to teach myself the electronics. And what I ended up doing was telling the story about how the light bulb became the transistor became the chip, and how the chip became the PC, and how a bunch of those things became the cloud. And in that process, I had a chance to reflect, piece things together, and I was naive because not only was putting the story together really difficult, but writing in a way that was engaging is actually very challenging. And I had to learn that kind of on the fly.
Yeah, absolutely. And putting yourself out there, like it's one of those things. All these like channels, there's different ways for them, right? Whether speaking, talking, typing, whatever it might be, it's a fascinating sort of approach. So as you've sort of worked your way through telling this story, what have been some of the things that sort of struck you in these transitions you would have been making as the technology was going through these various different transformations, if you will, these like pivotal points? What were some of the things that when I think back, I still remember in 2010, I first joined ThoughtWorks. In my induction, Jez Humble sat down and just released continuous delivery. He was sitting there telling me about doing 1,000 software deployments a day. I was like, this is amazing. I can't wait to go do this. And then everywhere we went to talk to people about doing 1,000 deployments a day, they thought we were mad. They were literally like, no, it takes us 6 months to do a release. Like, how can I do 1,000 releases in a day? And, the answer was, you don't do what you're doing today. But it's, it was such a mind shift, So tell us a little bit about some of the paradigm shifts that you experienced, if you will, on this arc of going back through, looking at your own journey compared to these technology innovations.
I think the technology stuff never really surprised me. I was a little bit, I always said that a computer would never be a human being at Go. I was really confident in that because Kasparov, when he was beat by Deep Blue, is a brute force algorithm, and you can't brute force Go. And I genuinely believed artificial neural networks would never have enough data and computer power. And then so when Go eventually did fall to a machine, that really made me stop and think, because that's a belief I'd had since I was a student. And I was quite proud that I'd been right for all those years until all of a sudden I was wrong. But in terms of learning about the world, the paradigm shifts or the big moments for me have got nothing to do with technology, because that's my happy place. I even before I wrote Visionaries and Rebels, I knew the history of tech pretty well. I've always got my head in books. But I think for me, once I became an entrepreneur, I dare say it was one of the greatest disappointments of my life. And that is simply because when you work with your mates building computers or computer systems, you've got happy customers. Most of us don't lie to each other. Most of us are not deceitful. As soon as you're dealing with money and business people and investors, I experienced for the very first time people lying directly to my face. And then when I asked them, hey, about that agreement we had, them then saying, oh, well, actually this and this. And then I believed them again, right? I was like a character in a comedy. And then after 2 years of similar behavior, you're like, oh, wait a minute. Now I understand. This person's lying to me. And so for the very first time, I had to do something I'd rather have not have done. I learnt about how to deal with bullshitters. I read a book called Spy the Lie. I read a book about power. And intellectually, that was fascinating. But I did not plan to become a human lie detector. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with partners in big companies, they care way less about people and your feelings than they do about money. And that was a bit like, oh, okay, that kind of sucks. That is exactly what you hear, you see in movies, but you don't really think it happens in real life. So I was pretty naive, and the learning curve on that one was steep.
Yeah, but it's the crappiest learning curve ever, right? When people constantly let you down on poor expectation. Like I've definitely experienced that in my own career at times, and it's hard because when you come from a place of wanting to believe in people, a lot of these, management books you've mentioned, whether it's Maslow or Drucker, they have a fundamental assumption that people are acting with good intent, and it's often a system that they're within that sort of is limiting their performance, where you start to deal with characters who actually have bad intent and are constructing systems to essentially get leverage on the people around them. That might be a leverage in a deal. It might be leading people down a garden path. It might be gaslighting folks as well.
So the gaslighting thing is probably the most prevalent one. So these people, these bullshitters, they use the truth or small lies to continually persuade you. They're like ChatGPT. They tell you what you want to hear to keep the conversation going. Gaslighting is a huge feature of that type of person. But the funny thing is, for all the learning and all the education, is number one, I'm getting really good at spotting people. And number two, the key lesson is just be patient. Work with someone for a few weeks, see if they fulfill their promises. You'll soon work out if they're decent people. And number three, make sure you speak to your lawyer immediately, right? And I ran container solutions without lawyers for the first few years, and it's like looking back, it's like, oh my God, right? So these are just simple lessons, and most people will be like, yeah, duh. But I did mention earlier, I'm a computer programmer, and we're kind of naive by design. And the other thing, Barry, the other big paradigm shift for me was this leadership question. And what you realize is leadership is about making decisions for the group. And that means every decision has got winners and has got losers. And I know there are people out there right now who probably despise me because I made decisions that were better for the group, people who've been my friends, for example. That being said, I've got loads of people who've come up to me years later and say, I understand what you did 5 years ago. So you can see it's been on their minds. And so in a way, your soul gets dirty. You can't escape that without upsetting people and sometimes doing things you would rather not do. I would certainly rather never make anybody redundant or change an educational program because actually we can't afford it at this point. All of this goes against what I'm trying to do in terms of further growing people to, improve society. So you be careful what you wish for. Once you move into entrepreneurship and leadership, you lose a part of your soul. You don't get it back. But what you've got to learn to do is to live with it and then to not become bitter, to say, right, I'm going to put myself out there again and I'm going to roll the dice again.
Yeah, I think that is a very hard experience for people to go through. Certainly the first time they go through it, and then to sort of build the habit of actually having to go through it. Making people redundant is a great example, right? Like there's nothing fun about that. Nobody sits there going, unless you were George Clooney and Up in the Air, who generally enjoyed firing people. But for the rest of us, you're in these very difficult decisions where, there's no right, there's certainly wrong ways to do it. And really all you're trying to do is get to a place where people feel at least respected, heard, and they have context about how the decision was made. Again, the best book I ever read on that was The Hard Thing About the Hard Things, Ben Horowitz's book. And he's got a whole chapter about firing people. And I read it, and it was one of those things where I sat there going, actually, this helps me understand how I could do this in the least sucky way possible. But I know people are still going to be angry at doing it, and there were so many great little tips, like simple things like do it on a Tuesday. Why Tuesday? Well, because Monday you can come in, get the senior team or whoever's a part of the decisions aligned so they're clear it's going to happen. Tuesday is a day where you can say to people, this is what's happening, and they're welcome to then pack up at the end of the day and go and do what they want. And it gives the rest of the people remaining the other days in the week to process it, for you to be available for them to answer these questions. Doing it on a Friday is the worst possible day to do it, because you give people extremely bad information and then you give them no opportunity to get new information until potentially a Monday when they come back to work, sort of hypothesizing and filling all of that information space with negative information. Right. So there were all these like little tactics that just made me go, help me at least start to learn some of these behaviors to help you as a leader, that when you have to do really difficult things and make hard calls. And, I think that's, it's sort of a gift, because there's not that many places you can find that information. So what can we find in Visionaries, Rebels and Machines, of some of those tough choices you've had to make, and that can help people?
Well, there's not much in Visionaries and Rebels and Machines. And it's not a handbook on how to make people redundant. That's the damage trying to. And by the way, I want to put this on the record. I also don't expect any sympathy from your listeners. Those things were difficult, but I think once you put your hand up for leadership, you've got to process those emotions on your own. I can't stand these people who go on LinkedIn and say, the hardest thing I've ever had to do today was let these people go. And I'm like, you need to fucking suck this up, because if you stick your hand up for management and leadership, this is your cross to bear. And obviously the person who's done the redundancies is still in a job. Right. So it's completely tone deaf. So yes, it's emotional. And I remember once, I did an all hands at Container Solutions, and it was it was one of them, redundancies. This is happening. And I kept a straight face, and I always did it. And many, many times I've hung up the all hands from my office in London or from my home office, and I've just cried my eyes out. I've just put my head down on the desk and I've gone multiple times. And this was a particularly difficult one, but I was over in the Dutch office. And I did it in the glass room, and everybody was round the other side. And I did the meeting, and I closed the laptop, and I was gone again because it was awful. Now, what I didn't know is I just assumed people thought, oh, Jamie's fine. I never actually thought, oh, they must realise this is difficult for me. But of course, what happened is people came around, and as soon as they saw me, just surrounded me, put their arms around me. So for all those years, I'd been doing that alone, assuming that they didn't know what I was going through. With that all being said, if you put your hand up for this job, you carry that burden alone, and you deal with it with your friends or your coaches or non-execs. If you've got any that listen to you, you don't deal with it with your people, and you shouldn't look for sympathy, because that's the sympathy needs to go to the people who are moving on for whatever reason.
Yeah, but I think what you're also giving people hints towards is that you need a support system around you. Like one of the most important things, certainly I've seen, and especially folks who are doing the CEO role, I almost feel like if they don't have a coach, if they don't have external support or folks in place where they can go and let out some of the information and the pain that they have to absorb all the time, like it really worries me. And it's sort of a thing I look for when I'm even joining teams or companies. Is like, I ask CEOs, like, what's your support mechanism? Where's your off ramp when you have these, difficult situations, because they will come up. And if they don't have support systems, that's where I've seen, unfortunately, it fall into bad representations of themselves, which they don't really want, and they don't, the team don't deserve, and they end up being even more frustrated.
It's remarkable. So right now I do quite a bit of executive work, helping people out, friends. Sometimes I get paid, sometimes I don't. It's remarkable that it's usually men, usually white men in positions of power, who things are not quite working. And I'm like, okay, well, what's your planning system? Do you write yourself letters? Do you keep a journal? Have you got a coach? Do you have anybody who tells you the truth in your life? And the answer to all of those questions are no. And then they say, yeah, I've got somebody who speaks up to me. I've created a system where the team speak up to me. And I'm like, well, actually, they've just told me 10 things that you don't know. So you haven't created that system. So the level of delusion is remarkable. And again, I tell them how I manage companies. And just like 25 years ago, they turn around and say to me, well, you're naive. And I'm a bit like, you called me. You called me for advice, right? And this is my advice. This is what professional management and CEOing looks like. It's too much like a burden. It's too much like hard work. And so a lot of leaders out there really should not be in their positions.
Yeah, I think it's great though, again, as you're also sharing really specific and tactical techniques that people can be using. Like the letters are a great one. Journaling is, again, this habit that every time I do it, I'm like, this is so glad I'm doing it. And then I stop doing it. And then I'm like, God damn it, why am I not journaling again? Like it's one of these things where I get so much from it and then I suddenly forget how much I get from it and give myself another excuse. But I love the letters idea. And, obviously you put things like a system of people around you to help you as well. But what are one or two other things that you think that you would encourage other people as they're in these leadership roles that will help them, that helped you?
So I think, so first of all, there's lots of different ways to get the same result. So the journaling is important because it allows you to gather your thoughts and collect your words. So as a leader, where your energy goes, where your time goes, is crucial. People watch what you're doing. Now, you might only have 5 minutes at a coffee machine or passing somebody, and the words you say outside of official channels have huge impact. So if you've been in your journal and you've aligned what you're doing that week to your annual goals and what you're doing this quarter, you'll have access to your words. So I've seen executives turn up to an all hands and absolutely garbled, you do not make any sense whatsoever. And I'm like, it's because you've not been willing to put the hard work in to prepare. So journaling is just one way to prepare. It's a way to, speak truth to yourself. It's a way to gather your thoughts. There's many, many good things about journaling. The dark side of journaling is if you're conflict avoidant, you end up going over the conflict in your journal and then forgetting to speak to the person because you've let go of that emotional baggage. So there's a dark side to that. But mainly as a leader, you need access to your words. You need to choose where you spend your time wisely. So if there's a problem in sales, you should be in sales, but that does send a signal to engineering, oh, Jamie's into sales right now. So your priorities are reflected by where you go, not necessarily by what's in your PowerPoint presentation. Never forget, as an executive, your number one process is the decision-making process. So you don't make all decisions, but you do collect the information, synthesize it, and provide coaching to those below you. And now here is the ultimate paradox of high-performing executive teams. If you build a good team a bit around you, only the hardest and most disgusting, horrible decisions will ever make it to you as a chief executive. So the better your team, the worse the decisions you have to make because it's beyond what they can do. Now, if your executive team is just sort of developing and growing, lots of decisions will come to you as the chief executive. So the good news is a high-performance team means the business runs itself. The bad news is when they do bring you a problem that they can't solve, it'll be a doozy.
I love that. I really do. I'm always trying to find ways because it's hard to measure often, how the company is performing. Reed Hastings has that famous quote, like the less amount of decisions I make, the better I know the company is. But he doesn't add the quality and the type of decisions to be made are going to be pretty ugly, which you're right, because that shows that the team are dealing with a lot of the muck and bullets or the day-to-day challenges where really the thorniest, most wicked problems are really the ones that sort of, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your viewpoint, bubble up to the top, which is a great way to think about it.
So moving back to your question about visionaries and rebels, then what's in it for the reader, especially, readers who are running businesses. So I think the key theme of the book is that technology changes, but human nature does not. So the nature of technology evolves all the time. Human nature is a very slow-moving creature. So if you look all the way back to Edison and then Bell Labs, Robert Oppenheimer in the deserts of New Mexico, Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, etc., all the way up to Amazon and DeepMind today, the best way to manage techies is to create a safe environment where they can fail, is to remove obstacles. So you've probably heard of mushroom management, right, Barry? keep them in the feed them shit, keep them in the dark, feed them shit.
Actually, I've lived in it as well, which has not been fun, but yes.
Well, there is a positive way to spin that. So there was a book called The Soul of a New Machine from about 1981. It went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, and it was about a company that was building a new computer. And their version of mushroom management was to, when they said we're going to keep our engineers in the dark, they actually meant we're going to protect them from the noise and the stress of the outside world, and we're going to watch them grow. So their focus was on growing people. So they were like, we keep our mushrooms in the dark because we want them to grow. So those themes are common right the way through. So you've got to remove obstacles, take things away, and let people engage in the creative process, because it not only do you get better products and services, you get highly motivated people. So those handful of rules, psychological safe environment, letting people get on with their work, treating people with respect, that is a leitmotif right through the history of computing. And I actually say in the book, and it's a pretty mad claim when I think about it, but I end the book by saying, as far as I'm concerned, the management of technology workers is solved. It's a solved problem, and you need to do this, this, and this. And I think if people did those things, they would be running very successful teams.
Yeah, well, look, it's again, it's a fantastic book. It's packed with so many of these like little tidbits and own personal experiences. And yeah, thank you very much for coming on the show and sort of sharing your own story, twists and turns, dealing with tough decisions, and actually, welcoming them as a way of showing that the company is growing in the way that you hope when you probably first read that first line in Maslow's book about what it would be great to help people have an environment to do their best work. Jamie, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Barry.
Thanks so much for listening. If you found this episode useful, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please consider leaving a rating or a review, as it helps others find our podcast. For more episode and details about the show, visit barryoreilly.com, and we'll see you on the next episode.